The voting amendments. As we've been talking about the amendments to the Constitution, you've been thinking about how each amendment has come about, and we know the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, came together kind of as a package and were accepted basically as a bundle. And those amendments were designed to safeguard civil liberties. So the Constitution didn't really deal, at least in its original state, with a lot of the concerns that the Anti-Federalists had, who were worried about a strong federal government. So the colonists had experienced, say, troops living in their homes. So as a result of that, they pass an amendment that says no quartering of troops. That would be the Third Amendment. The colonists had experienced the Parliament and British authorities restricting their press, the free press. So they made sure that they included the freedom of the press in these amendments. And this can be said about rules for trial and speedy trial and cruel and unusual punishment. All of these things were reactions to what the British had done. Many of the amendments to the Constitution are reactions to situations that citizens found themselves in, and they felt like they were unjust. So these voting amendments that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes were in fact reactions to what many people in the country felt were not really holding true to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and this new Constitution. So Amendments 15, 19, 23, and 24, plus Amendment 26, are what we would call amendments that relate to voting. So again, the states are in charge of voting. They're the ones who make the rules, but if they go too far, then they go outside the bounds that the rule book sets. Remember, the rule book is our Constitution. So one of the big things that the Founding Fathers had to wrestle with in creating this new republic is who votes. The main thinking was, well, we should only let white men who own property vote. Because if we let everyone vote, especially the poor people who don't have property, then they will vote one way or another to remove the property from the rich and give to the poor in some form or another. So there was this thinking that maybe we should just let white men who own property vote. That's really the way it had been for centuries, in England and other countries. But in the end, they decided to put that burden upon the states, for the states to decide who should vote. And of course, most of the states would say, okay, we agree. White men who own property and who are 21 years of age or older can vote. And that's the way it was for a good while. But even from the very beginning, there were those who thought, this isn't right, we need to include more people voting. So some words we use for voting would be enfranchisement. So when you hear us talking about that in this class, or at any time in your life, we're talking about voting. And suffrage. Even though that sounds like it would be bad, suffrage really means the right to vote. So women's suffrage was this push in the late 1800s and early 1900s to get women the right to vote. So these amendments that we're talking about are amendments that were all about enfranchisement and suffrage. Okay? So you know about the 15th Amendment because that's part of the Reconstruction Amendments, which we've talked about in previous lectures and talks. But this one was one that happened right after the Civil War, and it gave African American men the right to vote. So if you read it, it says that you can vote, and the states can't keep you from voting based on your race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that means if you're a former slave, you can vote. And for the first time, we're seeing now in these amendments that they'll add a Section 2, which says that Congress has the power to enforce it. Now, again, you know this from government class, or you will know it, that Congress really doesn't have the power to enforce anything. It's up really to the president and the executive branch to enforce it, but Congress can direct the president to do that. So they're just adding a little bit of teeth here to try to show these states that were creating election systems, or that might try to create systems where African American men would be somehow persuaded not to vote or not allowed to vote in that state. And we have talked about that many of these southern states would figure out ways to keep African American men from voting, whether they might have to show that they can read or write. That would be called a literacy test. They might have to pay a little money, called a poll tax, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Or they might intimidate them through physical violence and terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And they would come up with very brutal ways to keep African American men from voting. So think of it like this. Think of it as a chess match, that every time the federal government would do something to try to help former slaves, many states in the South would try to counter that or move against it. So it's a back and forth. States would try everything to get around this rule, to find some way to go around the 15th Amendment. And we'll talk more about that as this course progresses. So the 15th Amendment is a voting amendment that said African American men can vote. The 19th Amendment is a popular amendment. It's about 100 years old now, so there was a lot about this in the news lately in the last year or so. So really, this happens right around the same time as all the Reconstruction amendments. There was a movement after the Civil War to let more people vote other than just former slaves who were men. There was a movement that we should let women vote. And there are leaders of this movement like Susan B. Anthony who would push for women voting. And, it's important to remember that there were some states that allowed women to vote from the very beginning of that state's existence. I can think of Wyoming, for example. They were a state that allowed women to vote in an effort to recruit women or to lure women with their husbands to come and settle in Wyoming. When they needed citizens, they needed families there, and they thought maybe this would help persuade women to come along with their husbands and start a new life in Wyoming. So there were several states that gave women the right to vote, but there were several that did not. So by the time we get to 1920, they finally get enough votes in Congress in enough states to agree to it that women now have the right to vote. And you'll see here on this slide that the last state to ratify it, or at least the state that tipped it over the 3/4 requirement, was Tennessee. And in that state, the yellow rose was a symbol of women's suffrage. And so Tennessee was I think the 38th state to agree to it. And now it would change the Constitution. The 19th Amendment, women can vote. So just to be clear, right, if a state like New Mexico passed a law that said only men could vote, that would clearly violate the 19th Amendment. And if it ever was passed, which it never would be, but let's say somehow it does pass in New Mexico, the Supreme Court would strike that law down, saying that law is unconstitutional because it violates the 19th Amendment. Now, the 23rd Amendment is a little bit different because it deals with the District of Columbia. So the people in Washington, D.C., they don't really live in a state. So I'm sure you've thought about this before, right? I mean, D.C. is not in a state. When they created the national city in 1800, this District of Columbia really was taken, the territory was taken from Maryland and Virginia, and it formed a perfect diamond. And in that perfect diamond, you would have this new federal city where the seat of government would be. Of course, during the Civil War, at the start of it, Virginia takes its land back, and that's why today Washington, D.C. kind of looks like half of a diamond, because it's really only the territory that Maryland gave. But there were people living in D.C. who wanted to vote. They thought it was unfair that they had no say in the government. And they actually wanted to vote on lots of things, but in the end, basically the amendment that got passed said they could vote for president and for vice president. So they don't get to vote for every little thing. They're under the control of Congress. But they do get to vote for president and vice president. They get to have this three electors, which we'll talk more about the electoral college when we study how a president's elected. But they basically get the minimum number that a state can have, which is three. So they do get a say in president and vice president, but that's about it. So even today in Washington, D.C., you can see that on their license plates they have the slogan "Taxation without representation," because they think it's ironic that this new city, that was the federal city, the home of a government that fought so hard to have its people vote, the people living in that federal city cannot vote for most things. So I remember this amendment as 23 in D.C. It's just all about D.C. voting, and it was passed in 1961. Should say it was added to the Constitution. So the 23rd Amendment was adopted in 1961. The 24th Amendment is, again, like we said, a reaction to things that were going on. So the federal government said with the amendment number 15, African American men could vote. States like, say, Alabama, they don't like that rule, but what are they going to do? Well, they start to pass laws in towns and across the state of Alabama or the state of South Carolina. And basically they would say, okay, if you want to vote down here, you have to pay a small tax. It was very common that you would have to pay a few dollars per year to vote. Of course, they would say, well, this money is to help pay for the election, the paper, the pens, the workers. We got to, nothing's free. We got to get these ballots printed, so it takes some money. But of course, the reason was they knew that many former slaves didn't have this kind of money. They couldn't have extra money, even a few dollars really, to spend to pay for a poll tax. So they probably just wouldn't vote. So it was a way of keeping former slaves, African Americans, and poor people from voting. So again, it's like a chess match. The federal government adopts the 15th Amendment. States like Alabama say, okay, well, they might be able to vote, but they're going to have to pay a small tax to vote. So that's their move in the chess match. Now, the 24th Amendment is a move by the federal government and the states that agreed to it to say, yeah, you can't do that anymore. A poll tax is unconstitutional. So Alabama, if you try to have a poll tax, that law that says there's a poll tax, we would declare unconstitutional, and we will not let you do that. So that happens in 1964. There are a lot of changes in voting and in civil rights in the early 1960s, as I'm sure you learned in your history classes. So the 24th Amendment is all about poll taxes. So I remember this 24, poll no more. So I'm going to no more poll taxes. 24, poll no more. Helping poor people, particularly people of color in the American South, be able to vote. And the final voting amendment is the 26th Amendment. And this really has more to do with, say, the Vietnam War than anything else. In America didn't know where Vietnam was, and the president had instituted a draft, which meant that young men who were 18 could be forced to go fight in the war, even if they disapproved of that war. And so many of them that lower it from most states had it at 21 down to 18.